Hello, everyone. I'm Ashnita Bali.
And I'm Marcin Ryzycki.
And we are going to talk to you about the differences between ElementRef, TemplateRef, and ViewContainerRef. Actually, we forgot to put ViewRef in our title.
Oh, yeah, and the title should be then the difference between ViewRef, ElementRef, ContainerRef, and something else, right?
The title is more an innuendo to talk about views, view containers, host views, embedded views, templates, and how they work together. Actually, we could have shortened our title to say Angular's DOM abstraction.
Or us like to think about it, it's like more like UI abstraction layer, yeah? Because DOM Angular application don't work just on the browser platform, but they also work on other platforms. And that's why the certain abstraction layer is being required to cater for all the UI needs, right? So why did we want to talk about this anyway, Ashnita?
Okay, when I started learning about dynamic components, I came across creating embedded views, or what was referred to as custom templates. I saw that when you use a ViewChild query to query an element, sometimes you get an ElementRef, sometimes you get a TemplateRef, sometimes you get a ViewContainerRef. I thought to myself, how am I going to remember all that? Also, when you create a dynamic component, you get the type componentRef. When you add that to a view container, it is of type viewRef. When a dynamic component is added to a view container, both when the dynamic component or the embedded views are added to a view container, they're of type viewRef, and they get added to the same array called the embedded views.
That's right.
But the dynamically created component is referred to as the host view, and the view created with the NgTemplate is referred to as the embedded view. So I thought to myself, how am I going to go remember all of that as well? So I thought Angular is so hard. So I spent more time learning about components and directives, and then thought, actually, the names are quite intuitive and make sense once you understand the concepts around DOM abstraction.
That's right, yeah. For me, confusing, for example, was that I'm seeing in the code viewRef, and the documentation says about view. Is it the same? I'm seeing ViewContainerRef everywhere, but nobody really talks about ViewContainerRef. Everybody says ViewContainer. Is it the same? So once you put things in order and know that there are concepts, and then there are code representation of it, and all these refs are really the representation of the concepts that helped me to kind of systematize the terminology about that, and there's no confusion. I see the code ViewContainerRef. I know we're talking about ViewContainer. We'll cover all this in a second, yeah? And by the way, there's more confusion here. Sometimes when you debug that stuff, you will see that it's actually not ViewContainerRef. It's a ViewContainerRef underscore. Why is that? Because ViewContainerRef is just an interface on abstract class in Angular code, and it's actually implemented by this ViewContainerRef underscore class, and that's what is being actually instantiated. But that's a minor detail, so let's not talk about this.
Okay, let's talk about the first piece of the abstraction layer, element, and represented by ElementRef. Looking at the ElementRef class, we can see that it is simply a wrapper around the native element, which on the browser platform is a DOM element, and in native platform, it will be something else. In our code, we work with ElementRef, which is us working in the abstraction layer. We try not to touch the native elements directly.
But later on, Stanimir has a lightning talk from web to mobile with native script and Angular, I believe. And we should go and check out what other native elements we can see there, yeah, when we are on different platforms.
So how do we access ElementRef? The viewChild decorator lets us query the elements in our view. It is another of DOM/UI abstractions. So instead of doing something like document query selector to query the DOM, we use view queries and query the views. We simply place a template reference variable on an element and pass it to the viewChild decorator as the first parameter. It will query. If querying a component tag, querying a component tag also gives us an ElementRef, since components create an HTML element. But if we pass in the component class symbol, we'll get a reference to the instance of that component.
Yeah, viewChild can be tricky a bit, yes, sometimes. OK, views. So we have elements, and they are being viewed sometimes, or always in the views. So what is the view? The view is the Angular documentation defines it as the smallest group of elements that can be created and destroyed together. And you see the snippet of code. It feels familiar, yeah? That's the view. And that's really it. The view is really defined by the template, a group of elements that Angular can create and destroy together. We have two kinds of them. There's a host view and there's embedded view. And the first one, the host view, is a view that belongs to a component. It's sometimes also called a component view. So there's lots of confusion in terminology, which we try to a bit debunk or systematize here. So yeah, let's have a look at this component guy. If the view, the host view is a view which belongs to it, then let's have a look at this. So we have a component. So component consists usually from component class, component directive, and some template. So it's the component, we define the view literally on the component directive. As you can see, there's a selector and there's a template there. And this is what is at the end that composes, that defines the view, the host view of the component.
Is the view static? Can I modify a view?
Well, Angular documentation says that properties of elements in a view can change dynamically, but the structure, number, and order can't. But you can change the structure of elements like by inserting, moving, removing nested views within the containers. That's a bit tough sentence, but it's quite important to understand. In short, how can I modify the views? We can modify views by modifying nested view containers. So then natural question arises, what is view container? So view container is a container for the dynamically created views. This is a container for the views, right? And we can see here, we have two examples of containers. Actually, there's one more. But we see on a div, we can actually use any element to use it as a view container. And the first example is a div. We place view, we place template reference variable on it, and we can ask for its view container. Same happens with the NgContainer, although this one is the best to use in such cases because it's a semantic use, right? And I know Ashnita is very into semantic HTML, so. Of course, you can, there's more places where there's more containers or things which can be containers. So we said any element, including NgTemplate, which we'll cover in a sec. Also, it's worth noting that the component, the host view, also makes it a view container. And with the component itself is a first view in that container. Although it's not dynamically created, so you won't be able to move it around. Yeah? So it's still part of the view. ViewContainer has an anchor element, and that's a very important thing. The containers, they have to be anchored somewhere in the DOM. They have to be attached to something, right? So it's totally required, and it's one-to-one relationship. Angular documentation actually highlights it. Each view container can have only one element, and each element can only have one view container. So if it needs the view container needs an anchor element, what with the cases when nothing gets rendered? Like NgComponentOutlet doesn't output anything. Same with NgTemplate, it doesn't output any markup at the beginning unless you do something about that. So what is the anchor element? So Angular renders for us in such instance the HTML comment tag. It's there. It's now we can anchor to it, but it doesn't impact the view. Another thing about view containers that they're always rendered. So views added to the container, they're always placed. They are rendered as a sibling element to anchor element. So view container has an anchor element. Anything which we add to that container will be rendered afterwards. Yeah? So you recognize that behavior from router outlet directive. It is a container as well. And the router instantiates all the components after that, after the anchor tag. Yeah? So we can see them underneath the router outlet tag. I was actually interested what you put, what happens if I query for ViewContainerRef on that directive, yeah, by placing view template reference variable on it and doing view child query on it, and what's inside, what are the embedded views there. Check it out for yourself, it's quite interesting. ViewContainerRef, so we told it about all the refs, so all concept in Angular, at least on this UI abstraction layer, they have all the refs to represent the concept in the code. ViewContainerRef is representation of the view container, of course, and a part of that offers also an API to modifying the view container, and that's actually the essence of modifying the view, right? We modifying the view by modifying the view containers. And there are two core methods here which we use sometimes or often: create embedded view for embedded views and create a component for component views, host views. Before we start playing with view container, let's have a look how we can get hold of it. So one way is via view query. Similar to what we were doing with ElementRef, you can place a template reference variable on it and use view child query to query for it. And in this case, by default, it will return you an ElementRef because you're querying on a paragraph tag. But if you specify, I want ViewContainerRef, this is what we will get. And then we have we can also ask on a constructor of the directive or component directive, and it will get injected from the injector. We actually don't cover it much here, but the dependency injection mechanism in Angular closely follows the view structure in the form of tree. So each view will effectively have its own injector with ready instances of ViewContainerRef or ElementRef and so on. So here we have, what do we have here? We have instead of ViewContainerRef, we have a component, and we place the first example in practice how it looks like, and we place an NgContainer on it. We see how it's rendered on the right. So we recognize the comment because NgContainer doesn't output anything but the container, which is the purple box, needs one. And we can read that using ViewChild, and we can use its API to create a component in it. And as we said, it will get render as a sibling element to an anchor element. Similar like the router outlet directive, right? And that rule applies to really to everything. Oh, there's a screen from like if we start debugging that view container in ref in the browser, you will see, you know, we just created the view there, so it's in this internal array embedded views. We can see that view container ref is associated to the view, to the host view. It has to be, it has to reside in some view, and we see that its anchor element, the native element, is an HTML comment on the bottom. Same applied to, you know, we did the example with NgContainer. This one is with simple paragraph. So as we said, any element can be used as a view container ref. So as soon as you place a template reference variable, you ask for view container ref, you get it, and you can start putting some views in it. And we do it here, and the result is on the right. And in this case, the only difference is that there is no HTML comment in it there, because it's not needed. The paragraph can serve perfectly well as an anchor element. Same case with components, with directive components, because yeah, component extends directive. We can access ViewContainerRef on its constructor, and we can start adding views to that container. It's maybe less common in case of components, but with structural directive, it's a very common thing that you ask for ViewContainerRef on the constructor. Okay, so that's, I personally think that ViewContainerRef is quite like an important thing to understand and to spend some, it was a bit of interest of mine. So, but anyway, it's all about real anchor elements, and it's associated with the host view, and it offers us API to create and move views, both host views and embedded views. And as we learned, it's always all the views added to the container will be rendered on next to the anchor element, right? That was it about views, yeah?
Thank you, Marcin.
And the view containers.
Okay, so now it must be time to talk about TemplateRef. So in talking about TemplateRef, we actually need to talk about NgTemplates, embedded views, and structural directives. But let's have a look at TemplateRef to start off with. Okay, Angular gives us a special tag called NgTemplate. The docs refers to that as the embedded template. And a TemplateRef is basically a representation of NgTemplate. And it can be used to instantiate an embedded view. So, okay, so a few things about embedded views then. First of all, as we saw earlier, views are a group of elements which can be created and destroyed together. Views defined in NgTemplate are called embedded views. As with templates, they can be, as with any templates, they can be reused. We use NgTemplate in our component templates all the time when we use ngIf and ng-for and maybe ng-switch. Embedded views, they get instantiated programmatically and embedded into a component view. And to me, I'm thinking, why are they called embedded views? Perhaps because they're embedded into our main view, they get called embedded views.
That's possible.
One difference between host views and embedded views is host views create an actual HTML element with the view defined in the component template as its content. So, and with embedded views, the view defined in the NgTemplate are not actually wrapped in any extra tags, so they get rendered as siblings to each other in just the container. As with templates, embedded views are not rendered until instantiated. They get instantiated by the ViewContainerRef's create embedded view method.
Which we see here on the detail. Yeah.
So here we have a closer look at the create embedded view method. So embedded views, once rendered, would change the structure of the component view. As we know, to change the structure of a view, we can do that by using view containers. That's what Marcin was explaining before. The ViewContainerRef API has a method called createEmbeddedView, which we can pass in the TemplateRef as the first parameter, and optionally we can give the context to the NgTemplate and the index on where to insert this view. And if by default it will be just inserted as the last entry in the container. So let's have a look at how to instantiate the embedded views. OK, so we could actually instantiate embedded views from our component class. We can query, we can use a NgContainer to be our container, because that, to me, it's makes sense to keep the markup semantics, so containers of containers, templates of templates. So, OK, we can get hold of the ViewContainer reference for an NgContainer and get hold of the template that we want to instantiate, and from using the viewchild queries in our component class, and then call the ViewContainerRef.createEmbeddedView method, passing in that template we got hold of. This would create an instance of the embedded view that will be rendered as a sibling to the ViewContainer, which here, since we're using NgContainer, it is rendered as a comment. And NgContainer and NgTemplates are not actual HTML elements, so Angular turns them into HTML comments.
Exactly. Next one.
Mm-hmm. So we could also place a directive to instantiate an embedded view. We can also place a directive on NgTemplate itself. Through dependency injection, so I've got an example here, which is dinosaur instantiate view. I mean, dino instantiate view directive. So our directive can, through dependency injection, get hold of the template, the ViewContainer reference, and since it's placed on a template, NgTemplate, the TemplateRef of the host element, and then call the ViewContainerRef create embedded view method, passing in the template that will instantiate the view.
So that's a template which instantiates itself and adds itself to the view. OK.
So the directive we just created is actually called a structural directive, because it's one that's changing the DOM structure and adding elements to our view. So the asterisk followed by the directive attribute name is the syntax to mark this directive, to mark structural directives. But we don't need to create our own directive to instantiate a view.
Or using this manual approach, at the very beginning, which you were showing.
So Angular gives us NgTemplateOutlet directive, which does exactly that. So we can just place that onto our container, like NgContainer star NgTemplateOutlet equals, and get hold of the NgTemplate. And here, it's quite funny to me, because we get hold of the NgTemplate using the the hash template reference variable, which gives us the template ref of the NgTemplate. But the terminologies are quite same, but obviously template ref is different to template reference variable. But OK, we get hold of the template ref and pass it.
What was TemplateRef? TemplateRef is a representation of NgTemplate.
Reference to the NgTemplate.
And the
so we pass.
Yeah.
So we pass that to just the NgTemplateOutlet directive, and that is like sugar syntax for creating, instantiating the view for us. So we see our code is looking much neater.
Than the first manual approach.
Then the one which we did in the component class, where we use ViewChildQuery to get hold of it and do it in the class ourselves.
Yeah, we could do instead of that. Yeah.
OK, so maybe we can have a closer look at structural directives. Angular's documentation explains this really well about how structural directives work and how they get desugared into the NgTemplate syntax. So as I said, the asterisk marks structural directives, but so behind the scenes it does a little bit more. I've got here the Angular's ng4 structured directive desugared into NgTemplate, so maybe let's have a look at that. The string we assign to ng4 directive is not the usual template expression, but a microsyntax. Angular wraps the host element that ng4 is placed on, the div, into a NgTemplate tag. The microsyntax parser turns the string assigned to ng4 into attributes that it places on the NgTemplate tag. The let keyword declares a template input variable that you can reference within that template. So here, let hero of heroes on the div becomes let-hero on the NgTemplate. So the parser also does takes the off and the track by in the ng4 case and prepends that with the directive name. So it becomes ng4 off and ng4 track by, and places them onto the NgTemplate tag, and these become the input properties of the directive, which is the ng4 directive that implements creating, instantiating the templates passed in for each of the heroes in this case. So, yeah.
That's all, yeah?
So
its bottom line is that every time we see asterisks and some directive, it literally gets wrapped into NgTemplate, right? Yeah. So that's why, by default, it's not getting rendered. We'll have to do some work there to instantiate those views.
OK, so...
You don't want to talk about context?
Yes.
No.
Yes, so...
Not enough time.
Have you run out of time?
Yeah.
So, I don't know, so if we maybe have a quick look before wrapping up about the template input variables, so as we saw in the create embedded view method of the ViewContainerRef, the second parameter is passing in the context to it. So that's where you can pass some context to the NgTemplate so it can use the data. So the context is basically an object where the first property is $implicit. So that is why, in the case of ng4, you don't have to say hero equals. So it it uses $implicit as the first variable, and then the rest are named. So so basically the context you pass in is an object which the template can make use of.
Basically, the context makes the embedded view quite dynamic as well. Yeah, it can have its inputs and dynamic parts. Yeah. So yeah, summary. That was the idea, to maybe help understand better bigger picture, right? I don't know if we managed or not. Hopefully we didn't create more confusion. And hopefully it's less confusion.
Oh yeah, and we would like to give credits to our Ultimate Angular course, that's where I learned first started learning about dynamic components and heard about custom templates and Angular in depth. So if you're not following Angular in depth, they're awesome.
Yeah, there's plenty of material about these things, and they're quite in depth. Yeah, and I called the Ultimate Angular also was explaining it for pretty nice, and I really enjoy it.
Yeah. So that's us.
Thank you
very much for coming to listen.